A scruffy young man walked into a packed Boston Telegraph office. The others wondered, where had he come from? His face was dirty, his clothes crumpled like he'd slept in them. Ah, fresh meat for the grinder, straight off the train. Most itinerant telegraphers had barely left boyhood behind them. This explains why telegraph culture was dominated by jokes, pranks, and a strict hierarchy. The plugs were the lowest, the second-class operators. Above them came the first-class operators, the best of whom broadcast and received the news. The formal rules of the company stated the first-class operators must always broadcast at a speed with which the receiving operator can process. Informal rules, however, said the new guy, had to be broken. They sat the scruffy young man at his station and asked him to receive the news from New York from a first-class operator. It came quickly, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, then quicker, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and then quicker still. The boy's focus was laser-like. The young man, savvy it seems, said, "You seem tired, old man. Why don't you try your other leg?" Other leg, of course, meaning other finger. The New York operator agreed. When the baptism of fire was over, the young man sat back, oblivious to his surroundings. When he turned around, everyone in the office stared at him, their mouths open. How had a 21-year-old done this? Alva was a curious little boy. He once sat on a neighbour's goose eggs to see how long it would take them to hatch. Patient, determined, endlessly inquisitive, laser-like in his focus but not formally educated, Alva, like so many frontier children, was taught to read and write by his mum. He modelled his parents' behaviour. They were self-starters, he was a self-starter. They were always improving, he was always improving. He wasn't, as those operators in Boston might have thought, a Canadian. His father, however, had been raised in Western Upper Canada. His family had fled the United States after the Revolutionary War. They were British loyalists. This created a strange identity for Alva's father, Samuel. Upper West Canada attracted both British loyalists, who were conservative by nature, and later Americans who moved up north in search of cheap and fertile land. The Americans were much more radical and reformist in their ideas than the British were. Samuel, of course, had descended from these British loyalists. However, he was more drawn to the Americans than he was to the British and their conservative nature. Alva later said of his dad, "He was a regular red-hot copperhead Democrat. General Jackson was his hero." Now that's General Jackson, the 7th president, by the way, and not General Stonewall Jackson, who fought for the Confederacy. Despite being the descendant of British loyalists then, Samuel was egalitarian, reformist, and free-thinking, and all of that rubbed onto Alva himself. Samuel eventually married Nancy Elliott. She was American. She'd gone to Canada with her family in search of that cheap and fertile land. Samuel and Nancy eventually had 7 children together. The first couple were born in Canada, but the 7th, which was Alva, the final child, and of course the youngest, was born back in the United States after they had returned. Nancy's background, she'd previously been a schoolteacher, allowed her to give the kids, including Alva, just enough schooling at home so they could read and write. Once they could read, they then had access to a handful of books that the family kept in their very small library. But my goodness, what books they kept there. Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Hume's History of England, and the radical writings of Thomas Paine. That bookshelf, though, contained something else, the 1850 copy of Natural Philosophy. Natural Philosophy had chapters on electricity, galvanism, I know you remember what that is, optics, electromagnetism, and that specific edition had chapters on a new-fangled and emerging field called telegraphy. Natural philosophy fed Alva's curiosity even further. This led to his friends describing his mind like that of a kaleidoscope. The pieces were the same, but as his mind rotated, they fell into brand new and different patterns. Later, Samuel said that Alva didn't have any boyhood days. It was all steam engines and mechanical forces. But I disagree with Samuel. Mechanical forces, steam engines, and blowing things up. There was lots of blowing things up, by the way, were exactly what children did in those times to pass the time. Not long after picking up natural philosophy, and no doubt fueled by his interest in steam engines, Alva started to travel on the railroad between Port Huron and Detroit. What he did next, I honestly think, is remarkable for a 13-year-old boy. At the Port Huron end of the line, he set up a small wooden stall. Down the line, coming back to Port Huron where his family had moved, he'd pick up butter, fruit, and then from other lines, working with another little boy, tobacco. All of these goods, of course, he picked up at wholesale prices, but he sold them at retail back at Port Huron. All of a sudden, Alva had had a taste for entrepreneurship, and he'd had it at a very young age. So to add to mechanics and steam engines and blowing things up, Alva had developed a knack for making money. Soon after the retail business took off, another formative event happened. Travelling back from Detroit, crowds gathered all along the railway line. They were eagerly awaiting news posted to the bulletin boards by the telegraphers about the Battle of Shiloh. People on the one hand were curious about their loved ones. Others still wanted to know who had won the battle. Had, in other words, the Union forces finally struck a blow to the Confederates? Alva had never seen such a frenzied need for news. Part of his business back then was selling newspapers he picked up in Detroit for a small markup back along the line. When he saw those people gathered around the bulletin boards, a flash of inspiration hit him. What if he could convince the telegraph operator back in Detroit to send more regular summaries of the news? This was a sort of advertisement. The people down the line would have an idea of what was coming back from Detroit in the newspapers. At the same time, Alva also managed, and I don't know how he did it, to convince the Detroit Free Press to give him extra newspapers on credit. This time around, he returned from Detroit with more newspapers. The telegraph operator had indeed sent a summary of the news ahead of the train. At Utica, instead of selling 1 or 2 copies of the paper, Alva shifted 30. At Mount Clemens, he decided, if there's a crowd when I get there, I'm going to raise the prices. So at Mount Clemens, the newspapers moved at not 5 cents per piece, but 10 cents per piece. By the time he reached Port Huron, he was selling the last newspapers in his possession for 25 cents a piece. 2 lessons struck him that day. The first was that he had learned how to make serious money. The markup on the 25-cent newspapers was gigantic. The second thing was the telegraph. What was this immense power he had discovered? Well, welcome to this episode of Visionaries, Rebels and Machines. My name is Jamie Dobson, and you have been hearing about the adventures of a wonderful little boy, a boy close to my own heart, Alva. In this episode, we're going to track his continuous upward trajectory, but in doing so, we're going to tackle some amazing themes from Visionaries, Rebels and Machines. The first one is systems. We're going to study them, and we're going to learn that when you understand one component, you get to glimpse the whole system and vice versa. We're going to learn all about the money to be made on the stock market when it comes to general purpose technologies and speculating on them. And we're going to get just a slight, ever so slight indication of where the great research institutions of the last century came from. With all that said, and without any more steaming dollops of foreshadowing from me, it's time to get back to this story and time to find out what happened to Alva after he bumped headfirst into the telegraph. Well, of course, you might imagine that what happened next is that Alva began to study Morse code and telegraphy obsessively. He sent and decoded his own messages. He listened to signals and, starting with that book, Natural Philosophy, devoured every scrap of technical knowledge he could put his hands on. Only 2 years after that, Alva began work as an itinerant telegrapher. Like journeymen back in Europe, telegraphers travelled from place to place, improving their skills, building their networks. They always travelled free. All they had to do was say to the conductor, "Hey, I'm a telegrapher," and that got them free passage to wherever it was they were heading to. It was, of course, on a train that Alva had arrived in the Boston office that day when the operator from New York had tried to break him. As soon as Alva began work as an itinerant telegrapher, he learned a simple truth about these machines. They were not very good. They often broke, wires needed fixing, receivers got stuck. It was therefore impossible to be a telegrapher without understanding at least a little bit, number one, how the machine worked, and number two, how to fix the damn thing. This explains why, as Alva made the journey from being a plug operator to being a first-class operator, he learnt about the machinery, developed the habit of continuously improving it, and all of that shoved him slowly but surely towards a future career in invention. What type of things did he invent? Well, one of his earliest inventions, and I really like this one, slowed down telegraph output. This machine, for example, would allow a first-class operator to blast the news from New York, but on the receiving end, the message slowed down, thus giving a less experienced operator a chance to decode the signal. This was practical, useful, inventive, and I would say pretty damn creative. After a few years tramping around, Alva thought maybe it was time to put down roots. He'd gotten pretty good at inventing, and maybe, just maybe, he thought he could do that in a single place and he could do it full time. Why did he think that? Well, actually, he'd already been a customer of Charles Williams and his workshop in Boston. Charles Williams, you remember, fronted that shop, and talented engineers like Thomas Watson worked out the back. Alva must have come to the conclusion, well, they're not doing anything at Charles Williams's place that I couldn't do. That kaleidoscopic mind of his was turning again. Why not invent full-time? Then, applying the lessons he'd learnt between Detroit and Port Huron, he telegraphed the news down the wire as a form of advertisement, of course, letting the whole of the telegraph community to know he was going to set up a shop, and he was going to set up that shop in New York. Ever the optimist, ever the confident American, ever the free thinker, Alva established himself in less than 2 years, and, according to Western Union's boss, William Orton, was the best electromechanic in the country. How on earth had he done this? All right, dear listener, I'll put you out of your misery now. You have, of course, been listening to the rapid rise of Thomas Alva Edison. Alva, as he was known to his friends and family, started using his given name, his first name, when he entered the world of work. So William Orton, when he described him as the most talented electromechanic in the country, was talking about Thomas Edison. His rise, as you can see from this story so far, was rapid. It does not slow down when he arrives in New York. He won his first contract as an inventor within just a couple of weeks of landing there. Now, what was that invention? I know that's what you're thinking, because, of course, when we think of Edison, we think of light bulbs and we think of the electricity grid. There is a vague notion somewhere in our minds that he wronged Nikola Tesla. Well, the first contract naturally came from the Gould and Stock Telegraph Company. Don't forget, Thomas Edison was known at this point for improving the telegraph system. They wanted what they called a one-wire printing telegraph. On the receiving end, instead of dots and dashes coming from the stock exchange, prices of stocks and shares and, of course, gold would be printed out on a small slither of paper. No decoding telegraph operator was required. Gould and Stock paid Edison $7,000 for the invention for the one-wire printing telegraph. That was a small fortune for a 23-year-old. However, they then chucked in an extra $400 for machinery and said they'd pay him a salary as a consultant electrician if he created something that was later patentable. It was with all of that money that Edison was able to set up the Newark Telegraph Works. He had, in other words, began to recreate what Charles Williams had already built in Boston. The Gould and Stock one-wire telegraph is vitally important, in my opinion, for another reason. It's the beginning of Edison's obsession with capturing information, whether on perforated pieces of paper or, eventually, one day, sound. Something went down the telegraph wire, and instead of it vanishing at the other end, it became permanent. It mattered enormously to businesses. We know this because the following century, Xerox and their photocopying technology changed the world of business. Edison's captured information marked the beginning of automatic record keeping, and therefore automatic ordering, automatic invoicing, and a clear paper trail for accounting. This is not exactly e-commerce as we know it today. It was nevertheless the beginning of automating business processes, and these devices work for anybody. No technical expertise, no understanding of Morse code were required. Edison continued with this chain of thought. It wasn't long, therefore, before he actually invented ticker tape technology. Gould and Stock were delighted with that one. $15,000 they paid for the rights. That's nearly $400,000 in today's money. Funds were, in other words, flowing into Edison's Newark workshop. He wasn't rich yet, but he certainly wasn't poor. The tenacity that he'd shown as a young man and then later as an itinerant telegrapher was all of a sudden paying off and roaring back to life as his early prototypes and his early inventions right there in Newark. Thomas Edison busied himself in those early weeks and months in New York. He juggled multiple ventures because while he was running the Newark Telegraph Works, he was also in partnership with a man called Pope in the rather unimaginatively, it has to be said, Pope, Edison and Company Electrical Engineers. What this all really means is that within a short space of time, Thomas had built a complex web of relationships, associations and shareholdings, and he placed himself right in the centre of that web. He managed shareholders in multiple companies, he consulted to others, he owned the full rights to some of his inventions, but only partial rights to others. Most people would struggle to deal with this complexity, but Edison's ability to coordinate all those different strands like the spider in the centre of that web proved crucial to his success. This was that kaleidoscopic mind of his again, always turning and always recombining those little pieces into something brand new. It didn't take long, of course, for Gould and Stock to catch the attention of William Orton. He was the boss at Western Union, and at that time, Western Union was without a doubt the most powerful company in the United States, if not the world. William Orton was always looking for ways to make his system cheaper and to expand its reach so that they could onboard new users. General Lefferts, the founder of Gould and Stock, was very canny. He listed Thomas Edison as a company asset. Well, obviously, this is patently ridiculous. The Union forces had, of course, won the Civil War by this point, and slavery was abolished. Edison was a subcontractor. He was a human being, so he cannot possibly be listed as an asset on anybody's balance sheet. But General Lefferts was savvy. He knew that it wasn't just the patents that mattered to William Orton, but also the man who seemingly continually invented them. This is why, when Orton learnt about Edison, he jumped to the quick conclusion that yes, this lad, this young man, probably was the best electromechanic in the country. Eventually, Western Union acquired Gould and Stock. Edison did remarkably well in this deal. Gould and Stock, first of all, would remain a subsidiary of Western Union. That meant that Edison could continue to work for them. His salary would be $3,000 a year. However, in the deal, he also scooped up $35,000 in stock. All totaled up, it was about $50,000, $1.3 million in today's money. This meant that Edison had established his reputation, he'd established this complex web of business relationship, and he had started to accumulate real substantial wealth, aged still only 23. There was one thing, of course, missing in Thomas Edison's life. There was no love interest. That did change with the arrival of 3 teenage girls, aged only 15, in the doorway of the Newark workshop. It was raining. They took shelter, but one of Edison's colleagues recognised the girls. He invited them in, and later he said because his umbrella was too small, he could only fit 3 people under it, he took 2 of the girls home. This left Mary Stilwell alone with Thomas. She noticed his dirty, rumpled clothes, his oil-stained face. She also noticed his handsome eyes. They are handsome, by the way. You can take a look at Edmund Morris's biography. The portrait on the cover has an aging Edison, but those charismatic eyes are still there, and they're still very disarming. Thomas walked Mary home and then asked her mother, "May I call again?" He did this every night for 5 months, so by the time Thanksgiving rolled around, luckily Mary was 16 by this point, Edison readied himself to propose. I'll let Thomas and Mary take things from here.
Have you ever thought you would like to be married, man?
Well, no, not yet.
I have, and I would like you for my wife.
Oh, no, I couldn't.
Think now. Try not to make a mistake. If you had meant to say no, you would have said no already. I'll see your father tomorrow. If he says yes, we'll be married on Tuesday.
Good God in heaven, Thomas Edison, always optimistic, always in a rush, told Mary's father simply, I love your daughter and I will make her a good husband. I'm honest and I know how to treat a woman well. Thomas was honest and he was good, but he did not know how to treat a woman or in fact his own children. They would never take precedent over his laboratories and his inventions, and one day their family would pay a terrible price. Back at work, Edison continued to look for improvements to the telegraph system. Its biggest issue, of course, stemmed from its greatest strength. The telegraph had taken off because a single line carried a simple code of dots and dashes. As Western Union onboarded more customers, though, more and more messages needed sending, and that meant more lines were needed, and that in turn meant expensive copper. At this point, Thomas Edison started to think about two different technologies. The duplex sent two signals down the same line in the same direction. The diplex, on the other hand, allowed for simultaneous bidirectional communication. Two grains of sand were in the kaleidoscope of Thomas Edison's mind. When the kaleidoscope turned, they combined into something else entirely. This became the genesis of the Quadruplex Telegraph. William Alton very obviously valued this highly. $10 million was the number he put on it. Why? Well, it was obvious. It's because he could scale the telegraph system without scaling any of its machinery. But William Alton then made a terrible mistake. Thomas did not want to patent the quadruplex. Once it was patented, true, the inventor could exploit it exclusively, but it was in the public domain. Once in the public domain, other inventors might be inspired and come up with competitive ideas. Edison wanted to avoid this. William Alton, on the other hand, did not want to pay for something that was not yet patented because then he wouldn't be able to exploit it exclusively. There was a standoff. This is where Alton made a mistake. He didn't back Thomas Edison. Then, out of nowhere, like from a Victorian novel, a shark-like man whose reputation preceded him by miles entered into the story. Jay Gould had just sold a yacht for $30,000. He approached Edison, and Edison said, make me an offer. Well, he just sold the yacht for $30,000, so he said to Edison, all right, $30,000 for the rights to the quadruplex. Boom, a deal was done. Gould knew what he was doing. He was the owner of the Atlantic and Pacific Telegraph Company. This was a competitor to Western Union. With the quadruplex, Jay Gould's company would be able to undercut Western Union on price because they'd be able to send more messages down that single wire. However, Jay Gould was also in charge of the New York Tribune, a newspaper. He let the story leak out. Western Union stocks plummeted. Jay Gould knew that would happen, and he'd already shorted their stock in anticipation of the plunge. 5 years later, Western Union had to get their hands on the quadruplex if they were to survive. And so 5 years after buying the rights to the quadruplex, Western Union bought the whole of Pacific and Atlantic Telegraph from Jay Gould for a whopping $5 million. So Gould had turned the $30,000 investment into $5 million in profit, whatever he made from shorting Western Union stock, and whatever he'd made through the Atlantic and Pacific Telegraph Company undercutting Western Union. These were exactly the type of fun and games that happened in those opening years of Edison's arrival in New York. But after those opening years, he was getting well and truly sick of it. Sick of the financiers, sick of New York's hustle and bustle. He was sick of that Newark workshop, which he had in any case outgrown. Thomas wanted something different, something maybe better than Charles Williams' Boston workshop. His father, Pop Edison, Samuel, the raging Copperhead Democrat, still physically fit at 70 and still sadly mourning Nancy's recent passing from dementia, had found what he thought was the perfect location. An unfinished development on the junction of the Philadelphia Turnpike and the Pennsylvania Railroad. There was a house for Thomas and Mary to live in. There were two outhouses. One could be used for experimenters and the other could be used for the machinists. a very important division of labour for the work that Thomas was doing. This location was perfect. It was far enough from New York City for work to progress peacefully, but it was close enough for financiers to jump on a train and come and see Thomas Edison, should they need to. By the time Pop Edison had finished renovating the buildings, his second child had arrived. Thomas Jr. came along at the beginning of 1876. He joined Marion, who had been born in February 73. Edison called them Dot and Dash. Unfortunately, when the third child came, there was no telegraphic nickname to give them because Dot and Dash had already been taken, and unfortunately, in binary systems, there are only two symbols. The facility at Menlo Park quickly became known as the Invention Factory. Edison's aim was to invent something monthly, with major breakthroughs coming every 3, 4, 5 or 6 months. But where would he start at Menlo Park? Well, William Orton was whispering in his ear. Telephony was the word he was saying. That has to be what comes next. Thomas could change electrical signals into dots and dashes or stop prices on a ticker tape. But could he change an electrical signal into sound? Orton needed Thomas's help with the telephone system as he had once needed his help with the telegraph system. We know Edison's first major contribution was the microphone. Western Union were desperately trying to replicate Alexander Graham Bell's system, but they needed a much more practical way to capture sounds and convert them into an electrical signal. Now let's just pause for 1 minute. Is the microphone really different to the telegraph? No, I don't think so. A signal goes in, and at the other end, a signal comes out. The signals could be marks on a tape, stock prices, it could be other dots and dashes. Why not on the other end of the line create the same sounds that had gone in? This is an important moment because the kaleidoscope was turning again. That, of course, was the basis of the microphone. A sound went in and a sound came out. But now Edison's experience with telegraphy and making punch marks on a ticker tape started to collide with his world of sound. He'd been changing dots and dashes into marks. And he knew, because of the work of Alexander Graham Bell, electrical signals can be recreated as sound. Then, all of a sudden, it was happening. Instead of punching holes into a ticker tape, what happened if Edison spoke into one end of a circuit and at the other, instead of the sound coming out of a speaker, a sound, an ephemeral sound to be lost into the airwaves, what happens if it was somehow recorded? What happens if a pin, just like the pin in acid, made an impression on something? Let's say tinfoil. Dots and dashes on bits of paper, indentations on tinfoil. Was it really that different? Tinfoil was extremely malleable. What happens if Thomas Edison then reversed the process, scratched the needle over the same marks on the tinfoil, fed it back into the circuit so at the other end, a diaphragm in a speaker vibrated? Could these shapes on tinfoil store and then be used to recreate a sound wave? Edison had had the idea, in other words, for recording the human voice. What a load of nonsense. How could this possibly happen? How does one go from the telegraph and stock prices on a ticker tape to Alexander Graham Bell's funny speaker to somehow recording the human voice? This had never been done before, and in fact most people wouldn't even have conceived it. He sketched up a quick design, gave it to one of his machinists, and it was simple enough. The user spoke into a horn whilst they turned a handle. The handle moved a needle along a cylinder. The cylinder itself was wrapped in tinfoil. Small indentations were left. When the user was finished, the needle went back to the beginning of the cylinder. The handle was turned and the process was reversed. Edison got the very first prototype from the machinist. He turned the handle and he said, "Mary had a little lamb. Her fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb would surely follow." They reset the machine and turned the handle so that the needle moved across the indentations. Crouched in Menlo Park, this is what they heard. Complete and utter shock. "Gott in Himmel!" exclaimed Edison's German assistant Kruse. What on earth had they done? How on earth had they done it? Captured a voice so that in the future, somebody long dead could speak to their children or their grandchildren? Had they captured the soul? Had they beaten death? Of all the moments in Edison's life, when he picked up that book on natural history, when he joined the train between Port Huron and Detroit and became an entrepreneur, or maybe when he became an itinerant telegrapher, they all felt like moments of transformation, but this was the real transformation. Edison, a good electrician, but unknown outside of the weird circles of telegraphy, was instantly famous because of the phonograph. People understood it intuitively in exactly the same way they did not understand Samuel Morse's weird telegraph system. Thomas Edison was now on a roll. Although, if you're going to be honest, he'd been on a roll since he was 13. But now, he was not only famous within telegraphy circles, he was world famous. He returned from a trip to Wyoming. And when he came back, he started to sketch something he called electric light. Well, if a circuit could have a speaker on one end, or a telephone on one end, or a printer, like he'd stuck on the end of a circuit for the Gould and Stock Company, why not stick an incandescent light bulb at the end of a circuit? Thomas Edison was not the first person to have the idea to stick an incandescent light bulb on the end of a circuit. But Thomas Edison was also thinking about something else at that time. In New York City, gas was subdivided through the mains and pumped across the city through pipes and infrastructure where it was delivered at stoves and gas lamps. Edison thought, what if I could capture light somehow and then subdivide it exactly like gas already was subdivided? After he had this idea, he visited a man called William Wallace, not William Wallace from Braveheart, by the way. He'd been meaning to do this for ages. You see, Wallace had claimed to have solved this problem already in his little shed. He had an 8-horsepower dynamo and it powered 8 arc lamps. Now, I know you're thinking, I don't know what an arc lamp is, but you do. Listen to this. Right, you get the picture, don't you? That's the 20th Century Fox music, and the 20th Century Fox logo has those spotlights. So every time you watch Star Wars, you hear that tune and you see those spotlights. Spotlights are typically powered by an arc lamp. The problem is that arc lamps are too bright to use practically in the street or in a house. They're so bright, in fact, that they blind passers-by. Arc lamps had been invented and they were a known technology, but they were not practical for the subdivision of light. Edison went to see Wallace's system and he realised it's true. Wallace is distributing light, but the light is not properly subdivided. The legend goes that Thomas Edison right there and then sat down at Wallace's kitchen table and sketched out a better system for the better and appropriate subdivision of light. Edison's kaleidoscopic mind had turned again and all the parts were there. They just needed to be flipped and rearranged and configured as something new. Edison could see it. Dynamos that generated electricity housed miles and miles away in a central station. Copper pipe passing through the existing infrastructure where gas was already delivered. And the lamp. He just needed to solve the lamp problem. Edison knew that incandescent light bulbs existed, but they didn't work very well. If he could fix the incandescent lamp, boom, he'd have a system for subdividing light across the whole of New York City. And now it happened. The 13th of September, Edison grew impatient because he'd ordered some dynamos from Wallace. "Hurry up the machine," Edison told him. "I have struck a big bonanza." In his mind, copper wire, the incandescent light bulb he was certainly going to be able to improve, switches, meters, they were all going to be spread around New York, all illuminated beautifully. Soft electric light, not blinding. It would be the end of gaslighting. When word got out that Thomas Edison had struck this so-called big bonanza, that subdividing light was the next project he was going to do, the share prices of the gas company plummeted. Edison had already changed humanity with the phonograph. He transformed Western Union with his telegraphic improvements. He perfected the microphone and the ticker tape. Now he would do something nobody else had done or could do. Like a modern Prometheus, Thomas Edison would steal light from the gods and bring it back down to Earth for humanity. And if Thomas Edison couldn't do this, then nobody could. The trouble for Thomas Edison started almost immediately. Incandescent lights had been around for a long time. The trouble was the wire, what Edison would later call the filament. When it reached a certain heat, it would fizzle out and it would break. No wire, no circuit, no incandescent light. His big bonanza, unfortunately, was all about telegraphy. And what was telegraphy about? Switches. Switches at the beginning, switches at the end, switches that tapped out patterns, switches that helped to change a voice into an electrical signal. Continuing this idea, Thomas Edison thought, well, I'll just pop a switch in the light bulb, and when it got to a certain heat, the switch will disengage, the light bulb will stop burning, and it will re-engage a few moments later. The user would be none the wiser. This was pure arrogance. It was a conceptual idea, worked in his mind. It did not work in practice. Did it matter that it didn't work in practice? It's a fair question. Well, it might not have mattered, except Thomas Edison had opened his mouth. Thomas Edison was very good at opening his mouth. It all started back in September 1878 after that fateful visit to William Wallace. He sent that telegraph. Hurry up the machine. I have struck a big bonanza. Okay, no problems. Except 3 days later, he spoke to a reporter from the New York Sun. I have it now, he told him. With the process I have just discovered, I can produce 10,000 lights from one machine. Indeed, the number may be infinite. What process? Well, he didn't tell the reporter because he'd not quite worked it out yet. In the same article, the reporter shared Edison's promise, which was to replace the entire gas lighting system in Lower Manhattan, where the rich people lived, and he would do so by using all the old gas infrastructure. However, instead of gas going into lamps, electricity would be pumped in to bulbs. This was Thomas Edison as usual, using the press to his advantage, using the press in this case to create a sense of urgency. He had a powerful coalition with his team at Menlo Park and his financiers in New York. He'd communicated the vision now to the press. What could possibly go wrong? Well, when you're changing like this, after the communication and the urgency and the vision comes removing all the obstacles. But the obstacles to solving the problem of the incandescent light bulb were absolutely huge. Weeks turned into months. The press only reported dire and terrible news on Edison's progress from Menlo Park. Eventually, they completely abandoned him. There was nothing to report. The wizard, it seemed, had lost his magic touch. What on earth was going on at Menlo Park? How had Edison gone from being confident after he announced the big bonanza to stalling so quickly and so consistently that the press eventually abandoned him? It all hung on this idea to subdivide light, which itself hung on his new idea for the incandescent light bulb. If he couldn't get the light bulb to work, then he wouldn't be able to get the system to work either. His theory, or his observation, which was unknown to the press but was a part of the big bonanza, became known as Edison's electric light law. It goes something a little bit like this. The amount of heat lost from a physical body is proportional to the surface area of the body. That makes sense, doesn't it? I've only got GCSE physics, but even I can kind of understand that. If you imagine a long, thin wire, or if you prefer a long, thin person, because they're always called, aren't they? Then imagine that same long, thin wire squashed into a ball. You heat the wire up and you heat the ball up. They've got the same mass and the same weight, but because the surface area of the wire is much greater, it will cool down quicker. If you understand this, then you really do understand the basics of Edison's electric light law, and you understand the design of his very special incandescent light bulb, which was different to anything that came before it. How was it different? Well, the filament or the wire would be wound tightly. This would give off more light, but it would require less current. Therefore, it would create less heat and increase the chance of it lasting more than 5 or 10 minutes. The second part of Edison's electric light law and his big bonanza, his big idea, was that if the filament was wound tightly, the light bulb would become high resistance. Once the light bulb was a resistor, it would need less copper piping to bring the electric current from upstream at the power station down to factories in the houses in Lower Manhattan, which is what Edison had wanted to light up. This is the most important lesson of this episode from a systems perspective. By looking at a singular component, the light bulb, Edison learned something about the whole system and vice versa. By thinking of the system in terms of power stations, wires, and getting energy down to the houses and the factories, he understood that the light bulb had to be high resistance. The big bonanza then was all about the light bulb as a resistor. Once Edison visited Wallace, the grains of sand in the kaleidoscope of his mind, although not completely clear, started to turn. They eventually settled into a configuration which was the whole system to divide light or to subdivide light. Once the light bulb was a high resistant component, less copper would be required, and thus, for the first time in human history, making a system to subdivide light became feasible for the very first time. But herein lay the problem. The whole pack of cards, the whole system relied on Edison's incandescent light bulb as a resistor. He could not get it to work. And so as the weeks became months, the press abandoned the Wizard of Menlo Park. But then, late in the summer of 79, it happened. The miracle happened. What exactly happened? Actually, it's really hard to say because nobody really remembered. A collective amnesia descended over Menlo Park. The same collective amnesia later descended over Amazon when they invented cloud computing. What time was the bulb working? Nobody could quite remember. What was the filament? Yes, it was carbonized. It was definitely carbonized. But what was it? It was a carbonized bit of paper. No, wait a second. Hold on. Fishing line. It was carbonized fishing line. No, that wasn't it either. Coconut twine. It was definitely coconut twine. Nobody could remember the details. But whatever the filament was, this light bulb lasted 12 or 13 hours. In his excitement, Thomas Edison later said it lasted for 40 hours. Whatever actually happened doesn't really matter. The miracle had occurred. Thomas Edison and Francis Upton found a material that rendered beautiful light and could take the heat. Upton and Edison's other colleagues turned to each other and said, "The old man has done it." He was only 32. Thomas Edison decided now was the time to reopen the gates of Menlo Park. He organised a demonstration for New Year's Eve 1879, just a few months after Upton and Edison had found a filament that could render the light and take the heat. He invited his financial backers. He, of course, invited members of the press. He wanted them to know the Wizard of Menlo Park was back. They arrived that night after crossing a dark and lightless countryside. Fresh snow blanketed the whole of Menlo Park. The guests found Edison stood in the dark, his breath surely visible against his silhouette. And then, boom! With the flick of a switch, the whole of Menlo Park lit up. The crowd gasped in astonishment. Moments later, they burst into laughter. Another switch was flicked, and there were blinking lights. They had just witnessed the turning on of the world's first Christmas lights. Well, dear listener, what a remarkable end to part one of Thomas Edison's two-part story. We're going to leave him now back at Menlo Park, bathing in the warmth and glory and light of his incandescent light bulb. This, of course, leaves us with just one thing to do: wrap up this episode. What have we learnt? We learnt something about systems, didn't we? When you understand a singular component, you understand the whole system, and vice versa. We also came into contact with the world's first research and development laboratory. Menlo Park foreshadowed the great research institutions of the following century. Right at the beginning of the podcast, you remember that? We were introduced to boys' culture. This is a theme in technology because the young men who were drawn to telegraphy in the same way that young men are often drawn to computers have only just left their childhoods behind them as they enter into the world of work. Many historians will lead you to believe that pulling an all-nighter was a side effect of time-sharing computers, when young men could only get access to them when everybody else was in bed. Unfortunately, that's just not true. Thomas Edison's team pulled all-nighters all the time. So boys' culture is something that we will return to as this podcast unfolds. And finally, we met Jay Gould. He swept in and in doing so grabbed the rights to the Quadruplex and changed a $30,000 investment into $5 million worth of profits. We learned, in other words, there is a lot of money to be made speculating on general purpose technologies. Presently, we are in a speculative bubble. Nobody really believes the valuations of companies like ChatGPT and Anthropic. The question, of course, now on everybody's minds, what happens next? Who will be the big winners like Jay Gould, and who will be the big losers? As you ponder that question, dear listener, as to who the big winners and losers will be from this speculative bubble, let me take you back just one more time to Menlo Park. Thomas Edison had done it. His investors were right to back him in the same way that William Orton was wrong not to back him with the Quadruplex Telegraph. The Wizard of Menlo Park was back. The press had something to write about, and write about it they did. However, things turned difficult for Thomas Edison quickly. He faced financial battles, technical battles, and on the home front, with Mary's mental health deteriorating, personal battles too. It is to all of those battles that we turn to next. Hey everybody, thanks for listening. Just a reminder to follow Visionaries, Rebels and Machines on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do leave a rating and review if you like what we're doing. It helps other people to discover the show, and of course, we'd like a few more listeners. To find out more about me, the work I do, or to buy a copy of the book, please visit the website. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next episode.